My son-in-law called me a financial dead weight in front of his entire dinner table. I didn't say a word. I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and excused myself to use the restroom. I stood at the sink for a full 2 minutes, running cold water over my wrists the way my mother taught me when I was 12 and needed to calm down fast. Then I dried my hands, walked back to the table, and finished my green beans. What Thomas didn't know, what nobody at that table knew, was that I owned the strip mall his dry cleaning business had been leasing from for 11 years. I found out the next morning that he'd already started the paperwork to have me moved into Shady Pines assisted living off Route 9. My daughter had signed it too. Let me back up. My name is Loretta, and I'm 67 years old. I did live, until recently, in a small town in central Ohio called Morrow. It's the kind of place where everybody knows your car and waves when you drive past the hardware store. I've been here since I was 23, when I followed my late husband, Gene, here for a job at a manufacturing plant that closed in 2009. Gene passed 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless, the way that particular cancer tends to be. After Gene died, I had two things: a paid-off house on Carpenter Street and a grief so heavy I couldn't get off the couch for 4 months. My daughter Stephanie was 31 then. She lived 40 minutes away in Columbus with Thomas, who sold insurance and drove a car I couldn't afford to put gas in. She checked on me those first few weeks, brought casseroles, cried with me. I was grateful for every bit of it. What happened after that? The slow drift, the gradual way she started sounding more like him, I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it shifted. It's like watching a plant grow. You don't see it move, but one day you look up and everything's different. Thomas came from money. Not family money. His family was solidly working class, same as mine. But he'd made real money in his 40s through commercial insurance and some property investments that paid off. By the time he was 50, he had opinions about everything. What neighborhood was worth living in? What car a person should drive? What a 63-year-old widow in a 3-bedroom house in Morrow, Ohio was costing everybody just by existing. He never said that last part out loud. Not at first. He'd say things like, "Mom, have you thought about downsizing? That house is a lot of upkeep for one person." Or, "There are some really lovely communities now, not like the old nursing homes. You'd have friends your own age." He always said it pleasantly. He always said it like he was doing me a favor. I always smiled and said I was perfectly comfortable where I was. I grew up in Dayton. My father worked at a GM plant and my mother cleaned houses on the east side of town 3 days a week. We weren't poor exactly, but we were careful. I learned to sew my own clothes in high school. I bought day-old bread and made it into French toast. I drove the same Honda Civic for 14 years because it ran fine and there was no reason to replace something that still worked. After Gene died, I kept living the same way, not because I had to, because it was the only way I knew how to be. What I didn't talk about, what I had no reason to talk about, because it wasn't anybody's business, was that Gene and I had been buying commercial property since 1998. It started by accident, the way most good things in my life have. A small strip of storefronts on the south side of Morrow came up for sale when the original owner died and his kids didn't want the headache. Gene and I had been saving for 15 years by then. We paid cash for it. 4 units, a hair salon, a pizza place, a cell phone repair shop, and one empty space we rented to a woman who sold craft supplies until she retired and a dry cleaner moved in. That dry cleaner was Thomas's. He'd signed the lease before he married Stephanie. He never knew the owner. The management company handled everything and we preferred it that way. Gene always said, "Keep your money quiet. Loud money attracts loud problems." I never forgot that. Over the years, we bought 3 more properties. Nothing flashy. A small office building in Grove City, a warehouse space outside of Lancaster that we leased long-term to a regional moving company, a duplex in Circleville that we rented to the same tenant family for 16 years. By the time Jean got sick, our portfolio was generating just over $340,000 a year in rental income. Quietly, reliably. The way Jean liked things. After he died, I kept it all exactly the same. The management company ran the day-to-day. I deposited the checks and reinvested where it made sense. I kept clipping coupons at the Kroger on State Street because I genuinely enjoy clipping coupons. It calms me down, and because I had no desire whatsoever to explain myself to anyone. Stephanie knew Jean and I had some property. She didn't know what or how much. I'd tried to tell her once around the time she got engaged, but Thomas redirected the conversation to the venue deposit for their wedding, and the moment passed. I let it pass. I should have pushed harder. I know that now. The dinner where Thomas called me a financial dead weight was in March. Stephanie had made pot roast and invited her in-laws, Pamela and Chuck, who drove up from Cincinnati. It was a Sunday. There was a bottle of wine I didn't drink because I don't drink wine, and a conversation about property taxes that turned into a conversation about the rising cost of senior care, which turned into Thomas saying, quite casually, to no one in particular, "The hard part is when someone becomes a financial dead weight before they realize it themselves." He was looking at his plate when he said it, but everyone at that table knew who he meant. Pamela made a small sound. Chuck reached for the bread basket. Stephanie looked out the window. I folded my napkin and excused myself. When I came back, Thomas was explaining his plan, his actual plan, not a hypothetical, to move me into Shady Pines by June, sell my house on Carpenter Street, and use the proceeds to fund, as he put it, a more sustainable arrangement. He'd already gotten a quote. He'd already talked to a real estate agent. My daughter had already agreed. I finished my green beans. I drove home that night on Route 16, and I sat in my driveway for a long time with the engine off. The radio was still on, a Sunday evening gospel program out of WNCO, and I listened to the whole thing before I went inside. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I was past crying. What I felt was something harder and quieter, like when a door closes and you hear the latch click into place. I called my attorney on Monday morning. His name is Frank Abernathy, and he's been handling my affairs for 22 years. I asked him 2 questions. First, could Thomas and Stephanie legally force me into assisted living or sell my house without my consent? Frank said no, not without a guardianship proceeding, and they had no grounds for that. Second, could I legally terminate Thomas's lease at my strip mall property in Morrow? Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Loretta, when does his current lease cycle end?" I said, "August." Frank said, "Then yes." I told him not to renew it. Standard non-renewal notice, 90 days out, everything by the book. Then I asked him to quietly reach out to the management company for my Lancaster warehouse. Thomas's insurance agency had been exploring expanding into freight coverage. He'd mentioned it at Christmas, and he'd recently submitted a bid to lease part of that warehouse space through a broker. He hadn't gotten a response yet. He wouldn't be getting one. I'm not a cruel person. I want to be careful here because it's easy to tell this kind of story and make it sound like revenge, clean and satisfying. It wasn't like that. It was more like when you've let someone keep assuming something untrue for long enough, there comes a moment when letting them keep believing it becomes its own kind of dishonesty. Thomas had built his understanding of me on an assumption that I was an old woman with a paid-off house and a fixed income and no real power in any situation. He'd been making decisions, real, legal, life-altering decisions about where I would live and what would happen to my home, based on that assumption. Stephanie had let him. Maybe she'd started believing it herself. The non-renewal letter went out in early April. Thomas got it on a Thursday. I know because Stephanie called me on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after that dinner, and her voice was completely different from any voice I'd heard from her in years. Shaky. Confused. Like a person who'd just discovered a floor that was supposed to be solid had a hole in it. "Mom," she said, "did you know the building Thomas leases is?" She stopped. "Mom, are you the landlord?" I said, "I'm one of the owners, yes." Jean and I bought that property in 1998. She was quiet for so long I checked my phone to see if the call had dropped. For how long, she finally said, have you known that Thomas's business was there? I said, since your second date. You mentioned he ran a dry cleaning operation in Morrow, and I put it together. Another long pause. Why didn't you say anything? I thought about that. I thought about the wedding venue conversation and the pot roast dinner and the Shady Pines brochure I'd found tucked into my coat pocket the last time Stephanie hugged me goodbye. She must have slipped it in without thinking, or maybe she had thought about it. I still don't know. I said. I was waiting to see if it mattered. She said, what does that mean? I said, it means I didn't want the money to be the reason you treated me well. She didn't have an answer for that. Thomas called me himself 2 days later. I'll give him this. He called. He didn't have Stephanie do it. His voice was controlled, but I could hear something working hard underneath it, the way you can hear an engine laboring on a hill. He said the non-renewal would end his lease in August and that his clientele was local, that moving locations would effectively destroy the goodwill he built over a decade, that this felt, and here his voice shifted into something colder, retaliatory. I said, it's a standard non-renewal. You received proper notice. He said, Loretta, you know what you're doing. I said, I do. He said, I'm going to need you to reconsider. I said, I've considered it thoroughly, thank you. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. He said, fine. Then I need you to understand that if this is how you want to operate, Stephanie and I will not be in a position to offer you any support going forward. Any support. I want to tell you that I had a perfect response ready. I didn't. I just sat there with the phone against my ear, looking out my kitchen window at the lilac bush Jean planted in 1994, and I thought about what any support meant and what it had actually looked like over the past 8 years. I said, I understand. I hope you'll reconsider, but I understand. He hung up. The thing about a moment like that, where someone withdraws love like it's a bargaining chip, is that it clarifies things you'd been squinting at for years. Stephanie called me that evening. She was crying. She said Thomas was furious and that she didn't know what to do and that she wished I had just told them. Why hadn't I just told them? I said, would it have changed the dinner? She didn't answer. I said, Stephanie, would it have changed the Shady Pines brochure? She cried harder. I wasn't being cold. I want to be clear about that. I love my daughter the way you love someone you grew from your own body. It doesn't switch off. It doesn't operate on conditions. It just is. But love doesn't require me to pretend that something didn't happen. Love doesn't require me to smile and let it go again the way I'd let so many things go. I said, come by on Saturday. Bring coffee. I'll make eggs. She came without Thomas. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table she did homework at in 7th grade, and I showed her the property portfolio for the first time. All of it. The strip mall, the office building, the Lancaster warehouse, the duplex in Circleville, the current valuations, the income statements. She was very quiet for a long time. She said, Mom, this is... She stopped. She looked at me like she was recalculating something. Why did you never tell me? I said, I tried once, before your wedding. Thomas was talking about the venue deposit. She put her hand over her mouth. I said, I should have tried harder. That's on me. She asked about the Shady Pines plan. She asked it haltingly, like someone confessing. I told her what Frank had told me, that they had no legal grounds to force any of it. She said she knew that she'd known it was wrong, but that Thomas had made it sound so reasonable, so practical the way he makes everything sound. I said, he's very good at that. She nodded. I said, so am I. That was the first time she laughed. It came out surprised, almost against her will, and for a moment she looked like she was 22 again, and we were arguing over something stupid in this same kitchen, and everything was still mostly fine between us. I want to tell you how it all resolved, because I think people expect a clean ending to a story like this. They want the villain to be fully punished and the family to be fully healed, and the woman at the center to ride off into some kind of golden sunset. Life doesn't actually work that way, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I pretended it did. Thomas found a new location for his dry cleaning business 3 miles up the road in Waynesville. It's a smaller space. His commute changed. He lost some regulars, not all of them. He's still operating, which I'm glad about. Not for his sake exactly, but because there are 4 employees who depend on that business, and they had nothing to do with any of this. I made sure the new tenant in my strip mall was a flower shop that was already planning to expand in Morrow. I introduced myself to the owner. I was glad to have her there. The Lancaster warehouse expansion inquiry Thomas had submitted through the broker was quietly declined. I don't know if he ever connected that to me. I didn't feel the need to confirm it. What changed with Stephanie is harder to describe. She came back the following Saturday and the Saturday after that. She started calling on Tuesday evenings the way she used to before Thomas decided Tuesday evenings were for their gym class. Small things. She stopped passing along his suggestions about my house, or my finances, or my future. Once, in June, she told me that she and Thomas had argued about something she didn't want to specify, and that she had told him to handle his own business and stay out of mine. She said it carefully, like she was still deciding if she believed it herself. I told her I was proud of her. Thomas and I haven't had a real conversation since the phone call. When I see him at family things, Stephanie's birthday, the 4th of July, we are polite to each other the way two people are polite when they've both said things that can't be unsaid. I pass him the potato salad. He thanks me. We have not discussed the lease or the dinner or the brochure. Maybe we never will. I'm not waiting for an apology. I made my peace with that early on. Some people apologize and mean it, and it changes things. Other people apologize because they got caught, and the apology is just the next move in the same game. Thomas strikes me as the second kind. I could be wrong. I've been wrong about people before. What I know is this. I'm still in my house on Carpenter Street. The lilac bush bloomed late this year, June instead of May, and the smell came through my kitchen window on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee, and I thought about Jean's saying, "Keep your money quiet." I thought about my mother cleaning other people's houses in Dayton and buying day-old bread and never once acting like she was lesser because of it. I thought about the Shady Pines brochure. Then I refilled my coffee and called Frank to ask about a small office property that had come on the market in Delaware County. Good location, reliable tenant history. Reasonable asking price. Frank said it looked solid. I told him to make an offer. I've been thinking about what my mother used to say when I was growing up in Dayton. She'd come home on Friday afternoons, smelling like other people's cleaning products, set her bag down by the door, and say, "Loretta, nobody hands you your dignity. You carry it yourself or you don't have it." She never said it like a lesson. She said it the way you'd say it's cold outside. Just a fact about how the world worked. I didn't fully understand it until I was sitting at my daughter's dinner table listening to Thomas explain, in his pleasant, reasonable voice, that I had become a problem to be managed. Here's what I've come to believe, not because anyone told me, but because I've lived long enough to watch it play out over and over. The way you treat people when you think they have nothing is exactly who you are. Thomas thought he knew my situation. He had looked at my coupon binder and my 14-year-old car and my small house on Carpenter Street, and he had drawn his conclusions. And from those conclusions, he had built an entire plan, a real, legal, documented plan for what would happen to me. He hadn't asked me a single question. He hadn't needed to. He already knew. That's not a character flaw that appears overnight. It builds slowly, the way a habit builds, one unchallenged assumption at a time. And the people around someone like that, people who love him, who are used to how he operates, who have learned that it's easier to go along, they become part of it without always meaning to. Stephanie didn't set out to slip a Shady Pines brochure into my coat pocket, but she did it, and that matters. What I did wasn't about money. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to tell this story like a financial victory and leave it at that. It wasn't. The lease non-renewal, the declined warehouse inquiry, those were consequences, yes, but the real thing I was doing was simpler and harder. I was refusing to disappear. I was refusing to let someone rewrite who I was based on what he assumed I was worth. Jean used to say that the quietest person in the room is usually paying the most attention. I think about that. I think about all the dinners I sat through, all the redirected conversations, all the times I smiled and let something pass. I was paying attention the whole time. I was keeping track, not in a calculating way, but in the way that anyone who has been underestimated learns to track things, because you never know when the record will matter. Stephanie sat at my kitchen table and looked at the property documents and said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And the true answer, the one I've been sitting with ever since, is that I wanted her to choose me before she knew. I wanted to be worth something to her before the numbers were on the table. That's not her fault. That's just what a mother wants. The lilac bush outside my kitchen window doesn't know anything about any of this. It bloomed in June anyway. I stood at the window in the morning and smelled it and thought, you keep going. You do what you were made to do. You don't ask permission and you don't wait for someone to tell you you're allowed. That's the only philosophy I have. It's enough.